So moving on to where the mayor left off and Paris, I think we are in a very different situation since the COP in December. And it's easy to be cynical about these things, but actually Paris really was a breakthrough. The agreement that was reached there at COP21 is a game changer, and at least the momentum that it's created gives us a chance of delivering what we need to do on climate change to avoid a really catastrophic situation. An environmental commentator in the UK, I think, got it almost right, although he's a bit on the kind of doom side, when he said that Paris, compared to what it could have been, the Paris Agreement was a miracle. So actually, all of the nations of the world coming together and agreeing something on climate change, which has been such a difficult issue for the last 20 years, really was a miracle. On the other hand, he said, compared to what it should have been, it's a disaster. Now, I wouldn't say it's a disaster, but there is a flaw in what was agreed in Paris, in that it's a very aspirational target, and much better than most of us thought, that we should stabilise global warming at 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial average. And prior to Paris, most of the focus had been on a higher target of 2 degrees, but at least half of the world's nations have pointed out that they just can't survive with a 2-degree average temperature rise. But what the agreement lacks is a real mechanism for how that target is going to be delivered. And indeed, the treaty itself doesn't come into being until 2020. And that's really where I want to focus for the rest of my time, which is the role that cities can play. Because I think it's really the case that just as mayors and regional leaders and business leaders really provided, along with many, many community organisations, provided the bottom-up force that got those national leaders finally to agree to something in Paris, so now the nation states are looking to city leaders to deliver in a way that makes it possible for that Paris Agreement to really be delivered. And 3 reasons on the screen here why that's the case. The first is that whilst nation states have now got to work out how to make the collaboration that they've agreed to really work, the mayors of the world have been collaborating for a very long time. And in C40 alone, since the failed talks in Copenhagen in 2009, over 10,000 individual climate actions have been measured within the C40 network. Over 30 of our cities, so over a third of the membership, have already peaked their emissions. Global emissions need to peak in 2020, so they're way ahead of schedule. Secondly, that when we look at the potential for what could be delivered, and here just focusing on the C40 cities, about twice as much as has already been delivered has the potential to be delivered in the next decade. So in numbers, about 27,000 more climate actions that we think can be delivered, and just focusing on a small proportion of those that would have the biggest impact and where the powers are most clearly available already to the mayors to deliver. 2,300 priority actions could save 450 megatons of carbon between now and 2020. But the final one on the screen is probably the biggest one, and one of the things that captured attention in Paris. When you map forward and look at the decisions that are going to be made across the board, a third of the remaining safe carbon budget, and safe in inverted commas, the total amount of carbon that scientists have estimated we can safely risk putting into the atmosphere before making runaway climate change inevitable, a third of that budget will be consumed by decisions made by mayors in the next 4 or 5 years if they make bad decisions. So there's a huge emphasis on getting things right. The mayors that are in power right now making the right decisions in the next 4 or 5 years. And the biggest portion of those decisions will be made by the mayors in the C40. The other thing that I think in the analysis that's come out of Paris, when you look at this new target, this 1.5 degree stabilisation target, it turns out there's very little evidence base for how it can be achieved. Actually, there's only one really serious peer-reviewed scientific paper on it. But what comes out very strongly from that is it's very, very much a focus on urban solutions. So the previous targets had sort of maxed out the supply side solutions, the shift to renewable energy. What a 1.5 degree target means is we've really got to constrain demand for fossil fuel energy over the next few years. And when you look at where demand currently is for energy, it's mostly 70–80% of it is in urban areas. And so in the next 5–10 years, there's got to be real shifts in building energy use in particular, transport energy use, and both of those are systematically affected by the choices that we make around land use planning, the spatial development of the city, something that I know is a big issue here in Auckland. So very much the levers that need to be pulled to put us on a course to deliver the Paris Agreement are in the hands of cities and mayors. And we know what we're aiming for in the long term. John referred to this, the sort of the carbon neutral city target. What that means at a more individual level is that we have to get the average carbon emissions per person down to about 2 tonnes per person. Actually, I think that's a rather conservative estimate. It's going to be more like about 1.5 tonnes per person. There aren't any cities in C40 that would consider themselves to be fully developed that are at that level. There are some of our African cities that are way below. Addis Ababa is barely 0.1 tonnes per person. But when you look on the top of the screen here, the real leaders in the world and in C40 are the Scandinavian cities, hovering around the 2.5 tonnes per person. But most of the rest of the world, these are averages across the cities. The US, 16.5 tonnes, Australia the same. China, 7.2, that's about the level of Auckland from the figures that I've seen. The European Union a little under. So we're looking at reductions of 70, 80% or more over the next few decades in order to get down to those kinds of totals. The good news, I think, is that we broadly know what it will take to create low-carbon, healthy, prosperous, I'd just say simply successful cities in the future. Because there won't be any successful cities that aren't low-carbon. Let's be very clear about that. This is the race to be low-carbon is the race to be successful, prosperous, livable cities also. The two things are completely joined. And whilst in C40 we're not in any way prescriptive about what our mayors should be doing, it's very interesting when you get any room of the big city mayors together, and Len was very much part of this in Paris. All the mayors are talking about the same thing. They're talking about moving away from sprawling car-based cities to compact, dense, livable cities. High degrees of mobility, highly connected cities, but where the mobility is based on mass transit, on public transport, and increasingly cycling and walking. And finally, cities that are really coordinated, both in the sense of very data-driven, so very efficient in the way that they design the new infrastructure for the city, and working as a system, the departments of the city join together, the government working with business and with the community. But also, I think, critically, although I would say this, of course, the most successful mayors, the most successful cities in the next few years will be the ones that are able to look out the most, that don't just focus inwards, but see and are willing to learn and steal and copy from the best ideas all around the world. So just to go through those three headings. First of all, thinking about the concept of compact cities. And I think very simply here, sprawl is the enemy and density is the friend. You just have to look at the numbers. So the New Climate Economy Commission, which has done really outstanding work on showing the path towards a low-carbon vision of the future, they estimate that 60% of growth in energy consumption through to 2030 will be the result of urban sprawl. So just by planning our cities better, we could cut the business-as-usual growth in emissions by 60%. But you can see this in a different indice in terms of economic performance. The city of Copenhagen, and I'll come to explain the image on the screen, but this is of Copenhagen, one of the richest, most successful, most livable cities in the world, spends only 4% of its annual GDP on transport, on maintaining the transport system and improving it. Contrast that with another C40 member, Houston, who, by the way, has got a fantastic and very radical and brave mayor, but starts with a legacy of that real sprawling North American designed city. They spend 15% of their GDP each year on maintaining that car-based, sprawling city. And so Copenhagen has this huge economic premium each year by having gone down a compact, dense planned route. And this is no accident. It's the result of really strong regulation and legislation over 2 decades and based on really rigorous enforcement of that. And the simple explanation of it is that in Copenhagen, you're just not allowed to build any new major development if it isn't close to a public transport connection. And that's resulted in a pattern of density, which you see illustrated on the screen here. That definitely moved without me touching it. the red is showing where the highest levels of density are in the city. And you can see they have a kind of five-finger design that maps the 5 main public transport arteries into the city and then really dense at the core. And I should note here, in one of the richest cities in the world, 45% of trips to work are made by bicycle. And this is in a city, it may be flat, but it's bloody cold in the winter. It snows for 3 months, and they still cycle to work. A different part of the world, but the same philosophy, Portland in Oregon on the west coast of the United States, has got what really interesting proposal, again around dense, compact cities, but what they call complete neighborhoods. So countering the pattern of development there has been in the center of the city, it's really quite dense, and they managed to keep one of those cities that kept their old trolley lines, and it's allowed great public transport. But in the outer edges of the city, as they've grown very fast, similar to Auckland, from 200,000 to 600,000 people in a matter of a couple of decades, there's much more sprawl. So what they're trying to do there is to ensure that every one of their neighborhoods will have easy access to schools, parks, and grocery stores as a basic thing within walking or cycling distance. And this is forcing a greater density across the city, which is broadly welcomed. There are also, I've noted on the bullets on the side here, they'd be very envious of what I've seen here in Auckland. I saw someone describe it as a city within a forest, which I thought was wonderful. They're trying to get to 33% of their city being covered by tree canopy. I was warned about pressing these too hard. So that's 2 examples around the compact density. But there's a completely connected theme to that spatial design of being compact and dense, building upwards rather than building out. And that is the ability that you gain to have a much more efficient transport system, much greater mobility, faster journey times, lower emissions, greater reliability. And I love this quote from the now re-elected mayor of Bogota in Colombia, Enrique Peñalosa. An advanced city is not where the poor drive cars, but where the rich use the bus. And this really strikes home for me as a Londoner. Infamous, I guess you could say, Prime Minister in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher, once said, if you see a man, she was very gender specific, I'm afraid, if you see a man on a bus aged over 30, you know you're looking at a failure. And this infused British transport policy thinking for 2 decades that everybody aspired to be in a car and only the poor should be shoved on the buses. One of the greatest things in what Red Ken did in London was he changed the demographics of bus users by making the buses just so good that everyone wanted to use them. So you're as likely to sit next to a banker as you are to sit next to a builder or indeed a retired person or someone who's unemployed. But the reason why we really have to focus on mass transit is not just those questions of equity, but the pure statistics about the cost of a car-driven society. 3.7 million premature deaths from air pollution each year around the world, and that's probably an underestimate. 1.25 million deaths from road collisions each year. Congestion in many of the C40 cities consumes 4 or 5, or it has a cost of 4 or 5% of GDP. In Beijing, they estimate 15% of their GDP is lost through the cost of congestion. In the USA, the opportunity to move to more transit-oriented development is estimated to reduce household expenditure by 20%. So some real economic and social benefits from moving towards a more public transit-oriented system. And some examples of that from across the C40. One of the big success stories in city networks in recent years has been the total transformation in thinking about how you can use bus services. So rather than just being slow local services that stop all the time, that they really can be an alternative to the metro. Very much an idea that started in Latin America, in Curitiba, in Bogota. Bus rapid transit is now taken off all around the world. Indeed, the last time I looked, there were over 150 cities that had adopted it, and most now are in the rich West countries. But it started originally in Latin America because it's much cheaper to build an overground bus system than it is to build a new metro, a tenth of the cost on average. But if you build it to a specification that's really high standards, nice covered boarding, quality buses, not having to step up to get on them, cheap fares, then the people who use it feel valued and will want to shift to it, will take pride in taking the bus to work rather than the car. And the mayor in Joburg in South Africa has taken it a stage further. They call it corridors of freedom. And they're using their bus rapid transit to connect what are still the mostly black ghettos like Soweto, where there are very few jobs, with the city centre, the legacy of apartheid, connecting where most of the population live with where most of the jobs, but taking the release in land value all along the route of those bus routes, so that not just the property developers gain from that, but the city council is able to gain a tax premium and build social housing all along the route that helps people move out of the ghettos. Of course, if we're moving to a much greater extent of public transport, particularly the bus network, then the fuel that's put into them becomes really important. And most buses around the world still run on diesel. But there's a revolution underway, and it started in China. One of the really exciting things for us in C40 is in the last 18 months or so, the Chinese government has sanctioned Chinese cities to join C40 en masse. And as they start to engage, it's really changing the thinking of many other cities in C40. We've had a low emission vehicle network for almost 10 years, and the most ambitious cities have maybe had 10 electric buses on the road, 20 in some cases, none over 100. Shenzhen, near to Hong Kong, joined C40, came into the network and just said, what is this all about? We've got 1,000 fully electric buses already on the road. Our entire fleet of 8,000 will be totally electric within the next 3 years. Nanjing already has 4,000 public transport vehicles that are fully electric. Beijing has just ordered 1,000. They're manufacturing them in China, and it's in response to partly to the political pressures coming from poor air quality in China. But they're now building a really strong, and I'm sure very successful in the future, industry that will sell to the rest of the world. And indeed, we've used that as a spur within C40. 20 odd of our mayors now got together, having seen the Shenzhen example, and launched something, Clean Bus Declaration, which was essentially an attempt to shift the markets in North, South, and America and Europe towards electric vehicles. So saying to their indigenous manufacturers, essentially, if you don't start supplying us with electric buses at a price that we can afford, then we're going to be buying the Chinese ones. I think they probably will be buying the Chinese ones because they're available soon, but it's starting to shift the market. Boris Johnson told us in Paris, the Mayor of London, that the price of electric hybrid buses has gone down by 10% in just a few months since that declaration was launched, and he called all the European manufacturers into his office. And looking at the sort of the scale of ambition, and a city much smaller than this one, but with great ambitions like you have, Oslo plans, and I'm sure will succeed in being fully zero carbon for transport by 2020. Now, they can do this because they've got 100% renewable electricity for their metro system, but I can tell you that they're not just applying this to public transport vehicles. 30% of the cars that were sold in Oslo last year were electric. So very much stimulated by the mayor investing in the infrastructure, the recharging infrastructure, a tax system that favours electric vehicles and puts a premium on buying the old polluting vehicles, but also direct city investment in electric buses. And as we're not going to, in any city, there's not going to be able to be an entire shift to public transport, cycling and walking. We need cars, and lots of citizens have to have cars and rely on them. But some interesting experiments in how that can work. Paris, where I'm a lot these days, has been very successfully introduced a car hire scheme, much like their successful bike hire scheme, the Autolib, which for just €10 a day means that you can hire an electric car in the centre of the city. These little cars, 4 seats, but a range of 250 kilometres, so you can go quite a long way for your €10. But notably, as we talk to the major car manufacturers, in Europe in particular, but around the world, they're very much changing their business model in response to what the mayors and the big cities are doing now. So BMW is saying that its strategy for the future will no longer to be a company that manufactures and sells vehicles. They want to sell mobility. So they will sell people in a kind of club system the option to maybe have an open-top car at the weekend, but during most of the week to be using a ticket to use the public transport or to use a bike. And it's the whole package of mobility that they will sell, and they envisage selling a lot fewer vehicles over the long run. But I've left this to the end of the kind of transport segment, but actually for me it's really the one that's the most important, which is the return of the bike as an accepted form of mass used rather than mass used transport in major cities. And when I was a transport advisor to the mayor, it seems a long time ago, 16 years ago I started now, when I introduced the idea that we should be investing heavily in cycling to the then leadership of Transport for London, I was literally laughed at. Even though I was the representative of the mayor, they just laughed at me and said, you know, that we're running Transport for London, we're not going to mess around with bikes. It'd be hard to go to a major city now where you would find that attitude persisting. Most cities are desperately trying to enable more people to cycle. And some great examples around the world. The two images on the screen here are both from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And actually, the first one was taken on the day that I went to meet Mayor Eduardo Paes when he'd taken over as the chair of the C40. He arrived rather late for our meeting, which he's allowed to do. He's the mayor, but he was covered in dust, which was a bit odd, and kind of brushing it off as he came in. And he came in and kind of casually said, "Oh, I'm sorry I'm late, Mark. I've just been dynamiting a highway." And the image here is he had blown up that morning the 6-lane elevated highway that ran through the central business district and out to the across the port area. And what is there now is it's enabled them to put in a new light rail that will take people from the new Olympic site. This is all leveraging the Olympic investment through the central business district and out to a totally rejuvenated port area where there's this most extraordinary new museum, the Museum of Tomorrow, where C40 will have an office, as an office as of this week, indeed, and a cycle route that will connect up with now 450 kilometres of cycle lanes across Rio. Previously one of the most car-dominated cities in the world, and very cleverly using the Olympic legacy to do that. But we've seen cycling really taking off. Cycle share schemes now over 700 across the world. Only 5 of them existed in 2000. And some really good evidence for why you need to invest in cycling. So in Copenhagen, where, as I say, 45% of trips to work by bike, but there the city has estimated that the average trip, which is about 4 kilometres in Copenhagen, saves $1 each trip in health costs through improved health, reduced air pollution in the city. So a significant health premium for the city. And where in C40 we'll be putting most of our effort is in China. This is a country that until only a decade ago, 70% of trips in the big city were made by bike. It's now down on average to about 10 or 15%. But whereas when I was first going out to China 10 years ago, I was proudly being shown by the transport officials the graphs of how cycling had reduced and cars had gone up and how they intended to keep that going. Now they show the same graphs, but with the, we want to stop it here. And I think if you've got a 10 or 15% rate of cycling in your city, you really want to keep it. And I think they'll be successful. I hope, and then by the reaction, I guess most of what's been said so far is not controversial. I can sense in this city there's a lot of consensus about where you need to go. One of the things which generally is controversial, perhaps not here, is that it really seems impossible that the kind of vision of a city based on mass transit, cycling and walking can be achieved without some really difficult decisions like introducing road pricing. It's something I was very much involved in introducing in London, and it was absolutely the keystone of everything that Mayor Livingston was able to achieve. Both because in reducing 250,000 car trips into the city centre each day through what was then a very modest charge, £5 a day, just in working hours, It completely unlocked the space that enabled us to have a bus revolution, a shift, a 50 or 60% increase in bus passengers, 300% now increase in cycling over a period of a decade. But also it was very important attitudinally, because it sent out the message that the car is no longer king, that the roads are for everybody, and most people aren't driving. Most people, in London at least, are using public transport and cycling and walking. And London became, through that decision, the first major city in the world to achieve a shift away from cars to public transport, which continues to this day. Stockholm, which followed London in introducing congestion charging, has now registered a 35% fall in transport emissions. And note this, whilst their economy has grown 40%. Same case in London. So really successful economies on the back of brave decisions by very brave mayors that have changed transport in those cities. And I should say, in the case of London, because I was a political advisor to the mayor, every opinion poll that we took in the run-up to congestion charging said that the public was against it and that the mayor would not win re-election if it was introduced. 2 weeks after it was introduced, 60% of Londoners were in favour of it, and the mayor won with a thumping majority at the next election. So it just took that bravery to know that it was the right thing to do, and once people had seen it in action, that they would support it.